My name is LeAnna T. Luney, and I am a Lyman T. Johnson postdoctoral fellow with the Department of Educational Policy Studies and Evaluation. My research talk today is entitled, I Will Survive, Black College Women in Femme Coping Strategies as a Practice for Survival at Predominantly White Institutions. I hate to admit it, but I take grave concern for our predominantly white colleges and universities. We have been facing something that we don't quite recognize, and it will eventually consume the academy if we don't stop it. I'm not referring to financial crisis amidst an economic recession and global pandemic, declining enrollment rates, or professors who still don't know how to teach online courses. This something has been with us since the first day Euro-Americans crashed the shores to colonize this land, captured Black bodies for unpaid labor to create the most ferocious capitalistic society in human history, and created institutions that reproduce and uphold oppression. I'm referring to racism and anti-Blackness in particular. You may have heard the saying, racism is as American as apple pie and baseball, meaning that at the foundation of our oldest, most treasured and esteemed institutions lies a substructure of racism. Unfortunately, our colleges and universities make up some of these institutions. I would argue that racism is as American as predominantly white colleges and universities. Once we realize this, we should look to those who remain the most marginalized on our campuses to learn how to survive racism in higher ed. After all, keeping racism in our campus communities is not sustainable. So today I am here to talk about 3 lessons or strategies we might learn from my research on the coping techniques that Black college women in FEMS used to survive anti-Black gendered racism. If you remember nothing else, remember this. We will survive racism at predominantly white higher ed institutions, but only if we act. We must reformulate our definitions of racism, resist, and rebuild our communities. The first lesson is to reformulate our definitions of racism. When I interacted with students and asked what coping meant to them, there were all sorts of undertones insinuating that individuals' coping techniques cannot solve anti-Black gendered racism itself. And the key to understanding this is recognizing that dominant culture forces a shallow conceptualization of racism onto us. It doesn't operate how we might think it does. Racism goes beyond racial epithets and legalized racial segregation. The truth of the matter is that racism is entangled with other tools of white, male, heteronormative, and capitalist institutions. Findings from my study reveal that racism at predominantly white institutions intersects with misogyny, class, and homophobia, just to name a few. And we might have heard of this before. But what we might not know is the insidious nature of racism and anti-Blackness particularly. My study also uncovered the minutia of racism, including students' everyday interactions with colorism, featureism, and texturism, infighting between different groups of non-white students, tension between students of the same race but different ethnicities, gender identities, and sexual orientations, and turmoil between non-white administrators and students. I want to emphasize that these tensions exist within campus, socio-historical, and political contexts, where all non-white students, faculty, and staff feel the pressures of racism and anti-Blackness on campus, and sometimes remain complicit in white supremacy. Of course, reformulating definitions of racism also means understanding its reach on our campuses. It happens in students' living quarters, social events and parties, yes, including off campus, dining halls, and in our classrooms. I must note that we all play a role in upholding racist and anti-Black systems, and so no privileged person is free from fixing this. We, yes, even us postdocs and graduate students, must understand how intersectional racism operates in the 21st century to best prepare for its next form and survive white supremacy at predominantly white institutions, like our own beloved UK and academia overall. The second lesson we can learn from my research is that there is power in resistance. We must actively resist racism and anti-Blackness. Because my study explored the everyday coping mechanism of Black women and FEM college students, I had the opportunity to bear witness to their disengagement, detachment, and avoidant coping strategies. In my work, this looked like students distancing themselves from instances of anti-Black gendered racism and the after effects like exhaustion, self-doubt, altered self-image, anger, embarrassment, alienation, distrust in the university, and anxiety and depression. On the other end, findings show us that students felt that their disengagement, detachment, and avoiding coping proved to be unsustainable. The lesson here is that we must resist and actively face the reality of racism on our college and university campuses. Interestingly, many of the students I spoke with juxtapose disengagement, detachment, and avoidant coping strategies with engagement and problem-solving coping techniques, such as resistance. These strategies included direct confrontation with racist community members, policies and practices on campus, self-education, and even humor. The positive impacts of actively resisting anti-Black gendered racism for the students included feeling empowered, having a voice, a sense of purpose, and newfound self-care techniques. And so in other words, when it came to their survival of racism, students implemented resistant coping that allowed them to take anti-Black gendered racism and its after effects head on, ultimately leading to more sustainable experiences with survival. And so although facing racism and anti-Blackness is an arduous task, we must take it head on to survive. I say this to you as people in the academy who are early enough in our careers and who have the energy and the spark to create the change we want to see. The final lesson is to rebuild our communities. And this relates to findings on students' collective and communal coping strategies. All of us together make up one large campus community. But what about the microcosms or the smaller communities on campuses? And how might our smaller, more specific communities strengthen the university's survival against racism and anti-Blackness? When I talk about community, I'm talking about those that particularly deal with race on campus. Through the lens of collective and communal coping strategies, students in my study not only joined communities that empowered them as racially gendered, marginalized people, but they were also part of communities that allowed them to question the presence of white supremacy on campus and in their lives as college students. For many, this meant joining friendships, study groups, ethnic studies courses, and grassroots organizations with folks who had also committed to racial justice. Most notable was that students created communities in which they thrived amongst people of the same race and ethnicity. And so I encourage us in academia to push for spaces that are exclusively Black and exclusive to other minoritized identities. This also means pushing for exclusive spaces that provide strong examples of white allyship for white campus community members. Intentional community building with smaller groups will allow us to muster the strength to survive racism for the time being and to build a strong foundation for the larger campus community overall. And so in conclusion, Black women in Femme college students show us the everyday coping mechanisms they use to survive racism at predominantly white institutions. Our job is to listen carefully and follow their lead. And so I want to leave you with you all a few action items, of course. There's work to do. And so the first is to leave here and think about the true nature of racism and anti-Blackness on our own campus here at UK. What does it look like on the ground and systemically, and how do those work together? How does it impact the well-being of non-white students, staff, and faculty? And how might we work to survive it at predominantly white colleges and universities? My second action item for you today is to question and call out white supremacy on our campus. This might look like speaking out against anti-Black curriculum, policy, or campus culture. And lastly, I encourage you to get involved with affinity groups that discuss race, racism, and anti-Blackness. These groups can be with people of the same or different racial and ethnic identities as you, as long as they center anti-racist ideologies and practices. And if you remember nothing else, remember this. We will survive racism at predominantly white institutions, but only if we act. We must reformulate our definitions of racism, resist, and rebuild our communities. Thank you.